Firstly, if you like this video, please take the time to like it and subscribe to the channel, it helps us keep going. Now, the video that follows will be the first part into an exploration of the great Alexander the Great from his unique childhood to his experience as a student of Aristotle. We will explore questions like who really the great Alexander was, what his story was, and what would be the factors that would make the young Alexander so successful. We will also be exploring some of the key turning points of his life and what would happen at these points, and the different regions that Alexander would impact. But we'll start in the place that all men meet, their death. As Alexander lay dying surrounded by some of his commanders, the young leader would be asked a question that had all the weight of the world riding on it, and the fate of millions. Who would follow in his footsteps and become the next leader? Alexander is purported to have said to the strongest one. Several theories exist as to what had led to the young leader's death, with some records suggesting that it was after a drinking binge so extreme that it would leave the young leader sick and his health threatened, and the young leader who had defied death and stared at its cold, grim face so many times would succumb to the illness days after. Poisoning as a cause of death is another theory, with the young leader possibly falling foul to the political maneuverings of the domain he had come to create. He would be remembered for creating and forging increasing collaborations and interactions between the East and West, thus increasing trade. The effects of many of the changes he made would carry far into the future, enduring past his lifetime, including cities that bore his name, and a culture that would continue to revere him. The empire would extend close to 5.2 million square kilometers, the largest at the time. Some of the power vacuums he'd leave would become great realms, empires and monarchies in their own right. But how did his story start? It starts in 356 BC. Alexander III of Macedon was born in 356 BC, son to the king of Macedon, Philip II, and his wife Olympias, who was daughter to the king of Epirus. His birth would be surrounded by several legendary stories, involving the burning of some iconic buildings and Philip possibly finding out about the success of some of his fighting armies and horses. Some of his forces would be fighting the Illyrian and Paeonian armies. But others would come to argue that some of these stories were exaggerated, and some of them fabricated to embellish his story. But more stories would follow the young king for years in his childhood, some of them even more flamboyant than the ones that had preceded them. His childhood would see a woman named Launike play a role in his life, as she became a nurse to the young boy. His childhood would also see him learn several skills and be taught several subjects. Subjects like philosophy and logic, subjects fit for a growing heir who was destined for greatness and to achieve feats that would be remarked upon for decades and centuries after. It was in this childhood that some of the seeds of success would grow. He'd be taught in what would become like a school. Amongst his fellow students would be the children of several influential figures. And amongst these would be individuals that would remain close to the young leader and continue to occupy several positions around him as he grew. One subject that had been of interest for a while was who would come to tutor the young leader, and several options had been explored in the time preceding, from individuals like Speusippus to others. Ultimately, none other than the renowned Aristotle would be chosen. He would continue to tutor the young leader in several subjects. Some exiles from Persia would be found in the courts in Macedon, and they would come to offer essential and key insights into the state of Persia. Some of the individuals are said to have played key roles in the life of the young Alexander. The following years would see several episodes of interest in the life of the young king, starting with a period for which he would act as regent when his father would be forced to head to the north. This period would see the young Alexander have to face a revolt, which he would handle well enough. The resulting victory would expand the territory of Macedonia. Alexander at a point in time would also allegedly save his father's life. The period after would allow several chances for Alexander to show his tact in military strategy, and it was in and around this time that son and father would join forces and attack Thermopylae, gaining control. Amphissa would also fall. Philip's advance would meet some resistance in Chaeronea, which would lead to a battle known as the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC. The battle would occur between Macedonia and some of the city-states of Greece. The preceding events had led to a growth in power for Macedonia and for Philip, and had massively increased the power and resources of the nation. By the time that he would come to reach Chaeronea, Philip would be faced by a force that was his equal, and the battle would rage for an extensive stretch of time before the Macedonians gained an upper hand. The battle would eventually end up being more one-sided than a back and forth between the parties. This battle at Chaeronea would prove extremely decisive in more ways than one, for out of it came massive changes that would determine the fate of the Greek world. For one, out of the victory of the Macedonians came the League of Corinth. The League was a coalition of Greek states with several things in common. Philip II having created it under the guidance and encouragement of Isocrates, it would form one of the pillars that had been in Philip's plan to challenge the Achaemenid Empire. With everything now slowly falling into place for his long strategized campaign, things took a sudden turn when he would be assassinated. The culprit would be a figure close to Philip, Pausanias, captain of his bodyguards. Fleeing after the assassination, he would fall over a vine and his fate would be settled then. He would be killed as he fled. Alexander would be made king by the nobles and the army, and he would move to secure his power base from possible challengers. Cleopatra Eurydice, his father's wife, and their daughter, Europa, from the union would be killed by Alexander's mother Olympias. Thus Alexander would be forced to kill Cleopatra's uncle Attalus. Added into the emerging mix of complications would be revolts in several states which he would move to settle, before traveling into Corinth to be crowned commander of the League of Corinth, before once again departing off to quell some other revolts in a move to secure the northern border, defeating Clitus and King Glaucias along the way. The Athenian and Thebans would revolt once more, but Alexander would move to control these, putting them down before commencing on his campaign. As regent, he would leave a man known as Antipater, a man known both to the young Alexander, his mother Olympias, and his father Philip II. Philip's plan to invade the Achaemenid Empire would be continued by his son Alexander, and the year 334 BC would see Alexander with an army of around 48,000 soldiers cross Hellespont. This would mark the start of a momentous, history-defining campaign, one that would define the future for the inhabitants of the region of Asia, Macedon, and Europe, and impact history for decades and centuries after. Sardis would be forced into a surrender, and states along the Ionian coast, which had fallen under Persia, would receive democracy and autonomy due to the intervention of Alexander. Caria would fall to a siege by Alexander, his enemies would flee, and in their place he would place Ada. The Persians would also find themselves closed out from several naval bases due to Alexander's strategy. And eventually Alexander and Darius would lock horns in a battle at Issus. Alexander would emerge the victorious party of the two, and Darius would then be forced to flee, but now without his family, who he would attempt unsuccessfully to negotiate for, offering land, riches, and many other objects of value. Alexander would make his way to Tyre, which he would lay to siege, a siege that would eventually prove successful for Alexander. Things would become relatively easier before they became relatively difficult for Alexander. For one, several towns would surrender after the defeat of Tyre, but one would prove difficult: Gaza. In his attempts, he would have to face a man called Battus, and the confrontation would be important to holding off the Macedonians from reaching the Egyptian mainland. He would have to lay siege to Gaza thrice unsuccessfully before it too capitulated. Battle strategies used by Alexander the Great. Alexander would often win against the odds, against armies that were larger than his, and armies that were in their home terrain. He used as much as was available to him, from terrain, careful thought, well-trained soldiers, and well-oiled cavalry, to even his own presence on the battlefield with his soldiers, a tactic that would often boost the morale of his men, giving them confidence and inspiring them to greater feats and towards achieving many things. Another strategy he would use would be the Macedonian phalanx, a development from his father Philip. Some battles that were significant would include those at Granicus, Issus, and Sagdion. At Issus, in November of 333 BC, a battle that would result in a Macedonian victory. 37,000 soldiers of Alexander faced a force larger than it, and a battle that would be one of the first encounters between the two leaders Darius and Alexander. In the background, an endeavor by the Persians to cut off the Hellenic supply line after a loss at the Battle of the Granicus by the Persians, and Darius taking command of his own army would occur prior to the battle. Darius would effectively capture Issus and also maneuver his army behind the Hellenic League. Now things would be set for the coming battle. Many moves made in the preceding days would favor Alexander for the coming battle, from Darius choosing a battlefield that was smaller, but other actions would also favor Darius. Battle Day. The battle plan that Alexander would choose would mimic the one he had implemented at Gaugamela, holding up the left wing, and waiting for the opportune time to strike with cavalry to devastate the opposition army. However, things initially went awry on the battlefield. Crossing the river, and facing fortifications, Alexander's army would endure several casualties. But eventually the Hypaspists would be able to make their breakthrough, and so too would the Agrianians. Direct assault by Alexander on Darius and his accompanying bodyguards would force them to take flight. The Greek army would do the same, and triumph would become complete for Alexander and his army as he would pursue his enemies. Policy. In the lands that Alexander would conquer, several cities would be named after him. Several of these would become successful, vibrant cities even long after his death. Hellenization would be a process that many of the lands that he would come to conquer would undergo, a process that would see an adoption of Greek culture and language in some of the lands that had been occupied. At the same time, another process known as Orientalization would occur, where Persian customs would be adopted by the conquering parties. One of the challenges that Alexander would meet would be the ruling of people from disparate and different cultures, and reconciling these differences, a challenge that he would be successful in at times, and one in which he would fail at others. A process so successful in some ways that the New Testament written after would be written in Koine, a common Greek dialect, and that decades and centuries after, parts of the process would still have after effects in parts of South and Central Asia. The effect of this would also aid trade between regions, increasing the interaction between the East and the West. After the events that preceded, in the Temple of Ptah, Alexander would then be crowned, and several things would change within Egypt, several of them due to Alexander. Changes in the taxation system, the restoration of several temples in Egypt, and the founding of the city of Alexandria. Once again, Darius would be defeated and forced to flee by Alexander, this time at the Battle of Gaugamela, and things would continue to go awful for the former king. Babylon would be another region to be gained by Alexander in his push for expansion. Susa would be yet another. Going back to Darius, his time was drawing to an end, his power massively reduced. He'd find himself captured by Bessus, a kinsman. Darius would be killed by Bessus and his men, and Bessus would continue to claim succession. With Bessus fleeing, this would come to mark a beginning of another phase of events and set Bessus and Alexander on a collision course, one that ultimately only one would emerge from. Bessus himself would find himself given up in a twist of events that saw Spidamenes hand over Bessus to a companion of Alexander. A few challenges would still bother Alexander, one of them being the Achaemenid throne, and legitimizing his rule. Discontent also started to grow amongst his officers and some of his staff. Several plots on his life would occur. One of the more prominent ones would be one apparently undertaken by Callisthenes of Olynthus, his official historian, though it is somewhat questionable whether he was the one responsible for it. Alexander in India. India would be another target for Alexander, and this point in his expansion would see several interesting episodes, and would see Amdi, ruler of Taxila, take a significant role in it. When Alexander moved to invite some of the rulers and chieftains from several regions, those from Aspasoi and Asaknoi as well as some from other regions would refuse. At this point in time, Amdi would make several moves to assuage the concerns of Alexander, such as giving him a warm welcome into the capital city of Taxila. In response to some of these moves, Alexander would allow Amdi to retain his title and would gift him with several resources. In subsequent events, a battle of the Hydaspes would occur, which saw Alexander's army emerge victorious. Other campaigns would include those versus the Aspasioi and the Asaknoi. In some of these fights, Alexander would not be able to avoid personal costs, as he would be injured, especially against the Aspasioi. These campaigns were at times met with extreme violence. Forts, buildings and structures would at times be reduced to mere rubble in the events that occurred during the general period, and many would be killed. His battle with King Porus in 326 BC at the Battle of the Hydaspes would see an enemy transform into an ally. Impressed by King Porus, Alexander would appoint him as a satrap. The involvement and aid of locals in Alexander's actions in the subcontinent would be a prominent feature of his time there. Fatigue, time away from home, and the prospect of more enemies would play their roles in the eventual mutiny of his army at Hyphasis River. Alexander would be convinced to turn back. He would continue conquering other regions in his journey back, entering some of the regions he had already conquered. He would do many deeds trying to establish better relationships between his Persian and Macedonian subjects. A close friend, Hephaestion, would die, and this would greatly hurt Alexander. His plans going into the future would include an invasion of Arabia. But he would die at the young age of 32, not yet having done so. He'd die with no obvious successor, and contentious power battles would ensue after, splitting the empire that Alexander had created. But the changes that Alexander had made would continue somewhat into the future. Thank you for watching this video into the life of Alexander the Great and his achievements. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more videos on different subjects.